Hey gang, welcome back to another video. Now, so much of what makes movies like Star Wars and Aliens so good is the world building. And this isn't limited to just the important things that we see on screen, but also all of the stuff in the background that helps to ground these places in reality. So in this video, I'm going to do a bit of that world building for my own Star Wars space, but I'm going to need a bit of junk to get started. So let's get into it. I recently rescued this container from our recycling bin because I felt like it could be a good candidate for a bit of Star Wars set decoration. In its previous life, it held dishwasher pods, but with the help of some other bits and pieces I've collected from old electronics and leftover 3D printed parts, I think it'll fit right in for any Star Wars themed space. The only thing it was missing was a lid. So I took the opportunity to spend a little time making a 3D model based on the seats from Docking Bay 7 at Galaxy's Edge. And before I knew it, I had the proper lid for my container. Of course, I could have just used the one it came with, but any excuse to sharpen my modeling skills is a good enough reason to make my own. And after a quick print on my Bamboo Lab H2D, I had the part and could get to assembling the first panel of my canister. Whenever I've made any kind of space container, I've always been drawn to the idea of them having removable panels. So I cut the first of 4 panels from a piece of matte black acrylic, and then started to glue all of my greeblies in place. For the tubing, I decided to glue in a couple of pieces of wooden dowel so that I could have a good gluing surface for the tubes. So once the dowels were set, I added a few drops of glue inside each end of the tubing and glued it in place as well. I also applied an additional bit of glue to give me a mounting point in the middle of the tube so that it would keep a more interesting profile. A zip tie threaded through the openings on the battery door would have been a good solve too, but I didn't want to have to cut a recess into the canister just for that. The next panel is a bit less fussy, using an oversized off-cast 3D print that was intended for the inside of a Simply Juice lid. It got installed into another acrylic panel that I added the pill-shaped motif to, as well as a space for a switch to be added a bit later. The third panel is really simplified, since I didn't want the prop to be too busy looking. This used an offcut of acrylic from one of the other panels, as well as a couple of test prints that I made in clear UV resin. My hope is that this panel will act as more of a filler so that the more detailed panels can be the star of the prop. Of course, that didn't stop me from including a few holes for some 5mm LEDs, but what can I say? Adding lights just makes it cooler and somehow more Star Wars-y. The final panel uses this piece that I've been trying to squeeze into a number of these types of builds for a few years now, but it's always looked wrong. But my hope is that by recessing this part into the canister, it'll look more integrated into the panel and will finally leave my greebly bin once and for all. This, along with this fan grill, will get installed after paint. But for now, I'll use the panel to mark out its position so that I'll know where I need to drill the holes to mount it to the bin. quick test fit, and then I can get to marking and drilling out the remaining panels. Once I had all the screw holes and LED holes drilled out, I could install the panels and move on to paint. To give me a more uniform base, I'll be priming the canister and lid with my favorite rattle can primer, making sure to give it sufficient time to dry before moving on to my first paint layer. For this piece, I'll be using a bit of latex masking to create the paint chipping effect. So the first paint I'll need to apply will be this aluminum color. Once it was dry, I grabbed a tiny squeeze bottle of liquid latex and started to mark out the areas where I want the paint to chip. Now in hindsight, this is a bit heavier than I'd envisioned for this prop, but sometimes you just have to make the best of it. Once the liquid latex had dried, I gave the canister a coat of red spray paint, set it to dry, and then could get to peeling off the latex to see what my paint chipping looks like. This process is always fun, a bit nerve-wracking, but generally the best way to get the most organic chipping effect, since the latex and paint kind of do whatever they want, and so the chipping never has a super intentional look to it, which is a plus. When I had all the liquid latex removed, I could get to adding in a few of the greeblies that I wanted to remain their natural color, starting with this switch. Whenever attaching greeblies to painted surfaces, it's always best to rough up the gluing surface to make sure the parts make a good bond. In this case, I'm scratching through the paint down to the plastic with the side of a razor blade, and then I can glue the switch in place. And just like that, I've got my painted and assembled canister, but it's obviously too clean. Now before I can get to weathering, I always like to lock in my paints with a clear coat. This not only preserves the paint, but it makes the washes I'm about to apply easier to work with, since I like to go heavy and remove paint until I'm happy with the amount of grunge. Once the clear coat was dry, I could grab a brush and some black oil paint and started to dirty up the prop. Now if you didn't have oil paints, you could just as easily use acrylics or even alcohol inks and manipulate them until you got the look that you were after. It's really just a matter of personal preference. Should you decide to go with oil paints, it's really important to get good coverage with your clear coat. There's some areas that got only a light dusting, and I can tell because the paint can't be wiped off very easily. So while it wasn't my plan, there will definitely be some darker areas. Now, despite my best intentions, sometimes a prop will just tell you how it wants to look. Once the oil paint looked roughly how I wanted and had a few hours to dry, I grabbed a couple of my decal sheets and found a decal for one of the panels to give it a more in-universe look. Now, of course, this decal is a bit too clean, so it's going to need a bit of a touch-up to bring it in line with everything else. The last thing I want to do to this canister is to get LEDs wired up and installed. I'm using 2 flashing bulbs and 3 solid bulbs, and they'll get wired up to a 9-volt battery with these Wago nuts and press fit into the holes I drilled earlier. And then I can call this build done. So there you have it. A bit of themed prop making made from mostly recycled and random pieces found around the shop. Now hopefully this inspired you to build something out of those bits and pieces that you've been holding on to for a rainy day. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already. But most importantly, go make something.